Hello to everyone. I suggest we start. Yeah. Very warm welcome to everybody. I haven't seen a lecture hall so full for quite some time. So wonderful. Thank you very much for everyone to be here to this plenary lecture by Professor Pippa Norris. She's very busy and we are very, very honored and pleased that she accepted our invitation to be the plenary speaker at the EUTOPIA Week here in Ljubljana. Professor Pippa Norris, welcome. I hope that we hear and see you and that you hear and see us.
I do. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. I would just introduce myself. I'm Ksenija Vidmar. I'm a professor of sociology at Faculty of Arts and currently also vice rector for student affairs. And with me is Professor Mojca Pajnik, who will join me later in the debate. And also I would like to welcome Vice Dean Professor Samo Uhan, whom apparently you work with some years ago, I would not say ages ago, through the survey, World Value Survey. And of course, here are students from our university, but also delegates who attend the EUTOPIA Week here in Ljubljana. Very brief introduction. Pippa Norris is the Paul Maguire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and faculty affiliate in the Department of Government at Harvard. A prolific and award-winning author, she has taught at Harvard for 3 decades. She compares democracy, public opinion, elections, political communication, gender, politics worldwide. Google Scholar ranks her 3rd worldwide in political science citations. Major honors include numerous titles. We could be here until late this evening if I read all the titles, the honorary titles that she received. So I will just name a couple of them. John Hans Kite Prize, which is normally known or informally known as the Nobel Prize in Political Science. Karl Deutsch Prize, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Australian laureate, etc., etc. She has published around 50 books. Again, if I read all the titles, including the edited books, it will take hours. Just some titles from the very last few years: In Praise of Skepticism, Culture Backlash, Strengthening Electoral Integrity, Why Elections Fail, etc., etc. Again, I first met Professor Pippa Norris, writer, scholar, through her edited volume, Women, Media and Politics. I think that book was published in 1997. And in my course on global culture, her Culture Backlash is now obligatory reading. I strongly recommend all of you her latest work. Today, her lecture will be about her latest work, her latest book, In Praise of Skepticism, Trust but Verify. So, Professor Norris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would have loved to be with you in beautiful Slovenia. Unfortunately, it's our very last week of our semester, so it's a busy time here at Harvard and in Cambridge. And it's about the future of democracy as the broad title. And I know that your meeting has a fascinating range of activities and events and covers all the disciplines from science through to the arts, as well as the social sciences. And I'd like to focus, if I can, on the issue of trust, which has many multidisciplinary implications, and think about the value of skepticism and try to revise some of our conventional understandings of why trust is and is not important. And all of this is part of a broader project, which is called TrustGov, funded by the ESRC, and we'll go through some of the issues and some of the ways to think about it. And I'd like to start with a theoretical framework, which basically talks about the concepts of trust and how conventionally it's been understood in the literature that goes back now 7 decades and really think about the positives and negatives of trust. I'm going to talk about the research design and draw on the data. And as you mentioned, the World Value Survey, European Value Survey, is at the heart of the project. Over 115 societies now are included in that. And that's where I'm going to look at some of the evidence. I'm going to present a bit of the results, not everything, but just a snapshot to show you some of the findings and then the conclusions. And all of this is part of the book from Oxford University Press. And the subtitle is Trust But Verify, which you may remember Ronald Reagan used one stage in order to talk about nuclear testing and to be able to check on whether a country had decommissioned its arms. But it has a broader ramifications. And it's about how trust is valuable, but only informed trust, only justified trust, only skeptical trust. So what's the arguments and what's the claims I'm going to make? Well, I start the book with the well-known metaphor of the frog and the scorpion. And it's a fable which has been taught for many, many, many years. And the frog and the scorpion were walking along the bank of a river one day. And the scorpion said to the frog, look, we both want to get to the other side. Can I hop on your back and you can take me across? And the scorpion thought for a minute and he said, well, and the frog said, well, that would be possible, but it would be dangerous because you might sting me and then we'd both die and it would be a problem. And the scorpion said, no, I wouldn't have a reason to do that. So the frog eventually agreed. The scorpion jumped on their back and halfway across the river, of course, he stung the frog and they both drowned. And the frog said, why? And the scorpion said, well, it's in my nature. So what that highlights is that we need to challenge some of the normative assumptions about trust and its beneficial consequences. And there are so many studies which argued that either low or declining trust in the polls, in surveys, is a problem. Well, we need to think less about trust and more about trustworthiness. And from the point of view of the authorities, that's to say those who, for example, in government, are trying to get you to comply with the law, those who are medical authorities, encouraging you to take vaccinations, those who are academic authorities in universities, teaching you from their expertise a particular perspective. In all of those ways, trust and legitimacy are beneficial from the point of view of the authorities by inducing compliance. In other words, people go along, citizens will go along with their government, they'll obey the law, they'll go along with medical authorities, they'll protect their community, and so on. But the problem is that from the average person, the ordinary citizen, there can also be problems, particularly if you make erroneous judgments about who is and is not trustworthy. If, for example, you trust Bernie Madoff schemes and you put all your financial savings into a bank which fails, including in cryptocurrency in the most recent one. If you trust quack medicine and you go for cures like Invectamin, which is a horse medicine, rather than going for the vaccination, which has been scientifically tested. And if you trust demagogues or authoritarian leaders who say that they're acting on your behalf, but who aren't, then that's a problem. So why do we come to erroneous beliefs? Well, we're all very familiar with the problem of cynicism. Cynicism is where the authority is beneficial, but we don't necessarily take their advice. We don't go along with their judgments. We don't believe them. We don't think they're credible. And that's very well known. And that's an issue which has been widely discussed. But the other problem is equally serious, and that's credulous trust. Credulous trust is where you trust the untrustworthy, those who don't deserve our trust, those who we should not follow. And our accurate evaluations, I'm arguing in my empirical work, arise from two factors. One is cognitive skills. So the more education you have, the more knowledge, the more that you have information, then the better your judgments are going to be, just like in any other rational judgment. But the other factor is not individual, it's societal level information. So if you live in a closed society where there aren't alternative views in the press, where there's censorship of the media, where dissenters are thrown into jail, where there's no opportunity to hear more than the state's perspective or more than one viewpoint, if you live in a media bubble and you only hear one side or another, then that's going to be a problem. And what we need to do is less build citizens' trust, but to build government trustworthiness. So the authorities have three factors: competency. In other words, when they make promises, they actually do deliver, they have the resources, they have the skills. They need integrity, including honesty, transparency, so that people who can hear the words can actually feel that there's going to be a follow-through. And they need impartiality, so that people feel that the government is not simply fraudulent or acting corruptly, but people in power are acting in the public good. And above all, we should not trust individuals, but institutional guardrails. In other words, there has to be, for example, effective media in order to reveal government problems. There has to be a good opposition party, which is able to scrutinize government legislation. There has to be information about science and about other forms of decisions that we make in any society. And all of this leads to my next book, which I'm in the middle of, looking at whether or not there's genuine legitimacy, even in authoritarian states, for strongman leaders. I won't go into that in detail. I'll just mention that at the end as where this work is going as work in progress. So this is the book, and it's going to cover a little bit from the introduction, which gets the general theory, a mention of evidence, and touch on some of the causes, not go into them in great detail in a short talk. Now, one of the great things about the EUTOPIA Week is that it is multidisciplinary, and this is a topic which covers many different disciplines. So, for example, social trust, which is the work of those like Bob Putnam, has focused very much on interpersonal, how much you trust your friends, how much you trust your neighbors or other communities or people from a different religion or a different nation. And that's the field of sociology, social psychology, also behavioral economics, for example, in trust games, and organizational studies, when you look at, for example, how far there's trust within large companies between employers and managers. Trust in agencies of national governance has been more the sphere of political behavior and comparative politics. And also we're looking at things like trust in political parties and trust in leaders, and also civil society agencies like the media, or trust in the law, or trust in the police. And then lastly, we have trust in global governance, and that's trust in the United Nations or the World Health Organization, the IMF, but also in other countries and our relationships, for example, with our allies in treaties. And that's the field of international relations, also cultural sociology, and also comparative politics. So this is a field which has had an extensive amount of research. And I would argue that the conventional view, which has accumulated ever since the civic culture of 1963, is that trust is seen normally as a public good. And indeed, that's the assumption we're always making. So, for example, Bob Putnam, my colleague at the Kennedy School, argues it facilitates societal cooperation, particularly in weak states. You can work together in a local community to get things done. In personal relationships, trust is thought to sustain love and marriage. In markets and economic markets, again, if contracts are weak, Francis Fukuyama says you can still have trust, for example, between trading partners or between, again, trusted brands and large-scale corporations like the iPhone or whatever. Managing organizations, trust is thought as an important lubricant in order to get informal norms and informal forms of behavior working together for common goals. It can strengthen political legitimacy, the classic goal of Gabriel Armand. And the more that you trust your government, the more likely you are to accept voluntarily that the decisions they make are the ones which we should follow. Public policies, government regulations, recommendations. Rule of law, do you trust the police? Do you trust the courts? Overcoming polarization and gridlock, a particular issue right now in the United States. We're going to head after the 2022 elections into a period of divided government, but well before that, the polarization in party politics and the ways in which it's proved very difficult to get effective legislation through Congress has caused tremendous amounts of concern about this, and new work on how one might want to think and get legislators to work together. It can facilitate international peace, the classic argument of Bruce Russett, where democracies don't go to war with other democracies if they trust international cooperation and forms, for example, of trading relationships or security alliances like NATO. And think about Ukraine and the ways in which people have come together as alliances in order to support that country. And so overall, What's not to like? If trust reduces conflict, if it facilitates solidarity and cooperation, you might assume that low or falling trust should be a matter of public concern. And in the United States, for example, the Supreme Court was always seen as one of the agencies which really most people did trust, much more than Congress, much more than the presidency. And the fact that in the last year, trust in the Supreme Court has gone down as it's entered more controversial areas can be seen as a real matter, which is a problem. Why should people go along with the court if they don't agree with its judgments? And of course, in the extreme, we can think of all the problems which are associated. For example, QAnon and the ways in which conspiracy theories have always been part of politics. It's not a new phenomena, but it's certainly accelerated through social media. You can think of issues like Pizzagate and the claim, of course, that there was a paedophilia ring involving Democratic politicians with absolutely no background and no evidence. You can think of Invectamine and the idea that one should drink bleach in order to get rid of COVID. And of course, the culmination of all of this, the big lie, the electoral claims of fraud in 2020. Unfortunately, the most extreme forms of violence were avoided in the November elections this year. Nevertheless, the fact that there were people storming the steps of the Capitol on January the 6th and the ramifications of that in a country which has a high level of gun ownership and violence is one which has everybody concerned about democratic backsliding in the United States and in other countries where the big lie is common, such as in Bolsonaro's Brazil, which again dodged a bullet, I'd argue, but in many other places around the world where populism has taken off, including in Central and Eastern Europe. So if trust is important and trustworthiness is important, where does it come from? Well, there are three views about this. And again, they relate to different disciplines or different ways of approaching the study of trust. And so for social psychologists and psychologists, you can think about personality traits and how you get inherited characteristics from your parents and your family. And in this views, people are trusting or they're cynical, largely based on how they're born. And they inherit, for example, a feeling of being optimist or pessimist. They might be extrovert or introvert, so they might be trusting or mistrusting. And from the psychological perspective, you don't so much find the reasons for trust as you look at the consequences. And this is a view which should mean that trust is fairly stable. It doesn't change over a person's lifetime, and it should not change that much in terms of society. A second view, which is associated, of course, with my dear colleague, Ron Inglehart, who unfortunately we lost last year, is that trust is not so much individual, but societal level. If you grow up in Sweden or you grow up in Russia, if you grow up in Peru or you grow up in Germany, you might have very different levels of trust as a stable orientation. It's a cultural aspect. And in this view, your attitudes are acquired in early childhood, and it's from the main agencies of socialization, the predominant norms and values within each society. And you get them, therefore, from the media, from schools, from religious authorities, as well as from your local neighbors and your community. And again, trust is thought to change on this basis generationally. So young people might be less trusting than their parents or their grandparents, but it shouldn't go up and down that much. It should be a fairly stable orientation. The last view, however, is that we're thinking less of an individual or a societal characteristic than a relationship, an informal social contract. And in this, we can always think of the classic ways between principals who authorize agents to act on their behalf. And so the principal could be all sorts of people, as can the agents. It might be, for example, that you've committed a crime and you need a defense lawyer in order to provide you with legal aid. Or it might be that you need a heart operation, and so the agent is a surgeon and a hospital. Or it might be that it's a principal is a citizen, and they authorize a political party through voting to form a government. In all these cases, you have an expectation that the agent will fulfill their responsibilities in future with these characteristics: competency, skills. For example, for a surgeon, you might want to check what qualifications they have, whether the hospital has the resources to do heart operations. You want integrity, so that you know that if you have a financial advisor, they're going to basically have honest investments and not be like the problems which have just been recently encountered on cryptocurrency, which has gone bankrupt, causing millions of people to lose their savings. And you want impartiality. So you want politicians not simply to be there to gain their own power or line their own pockets, but to serve a broader sense of their supporters and the public interest in general. And you're making judgments about whether somebody or an agency or an actor is impartial and competent based on their past performance. And you're thinking, well, you're going to project that into the future. But of course, you never know. You never know where the past is going to be the same as future actions. And all of this doesn't matter if it's trivial, if it's a decision which isn't going to affect your life or your savings or your family or your community. But it's really important that you make accurate judgments under conditions of risk and uncertainty. If you're going to potentially put your life on the line in a surgeon, then you've got to make sure that that operation is going to be safe. So that's trustworthiness. And then, of course, the question is, how do you think about that in terms of judgments? So you can use this simple typology, which works well, as a heuristic framework. And you can think about how far a principle, a person, a citizen, trusts. It could be negative or positive. And you can think about an agency, how far their performance in what they do and how they act is positive or negative. And that gives us the two positions which I regard as normatively desirable. So think about an agency like in Sweden, and you might think about the health service and how far they have the resources and the capacity to deliver for their citizens, to produce longevity, to make sure that children are safe and that people have maternal safety, etc. If you feel that the agency performance in the past has been positive, then, and your attitudes are positive, that's skeptical trust. You don't trust out of a habit, you don't trust out of loyalty, you gather some information, you look at their track record, and you come to a judgment. On contrast, think about a case like the government in, say, Haiti, where the performance is highly problematic. The resources are lacking. It's a very poor country. The capacity of the government to deliver is extremely limited due to natural disasters, due to the problems of the coup d'etat, which destabilized the regime, due to the fact that the public service has limited skills and limited numbers. And so in that case, would you actually trust the government to deliver? And you should have skeptical mistrust about their abilities to actually do the things which might serve the public interest. But this also gives us two other positions, which are really the interesting ones in many ways. So cynicism is where you are mistrusting, and in fact, the performance of the agency is positive. And I'll give you a simple example from America. The Republicans have always been critical of the vaccination efforts of the government, and particularly the advice of Dr. Fauci, arguing that you don't need to wear masks and that the government has gone too far when it tries to prevent COVID being spread in local communities. For example, by limiting interaction amongst people in large social groups. And yet, if that advice is positive, if the recommendations of Dr. Fauci are effective, then that's cynicism. You're not acting in your own interests by not believing his advice or the advice of the medical authorities, which in turn is based on scientific peer-reviewed evidence. In contrast, however, we also have the other category, which is the one I think has been very much underestimated, and that's credulous trust. And after all, we teach children, don't trust strangers. Why not? Because you never know what the risks are and the dangers. And it might be that there are very negative consequences if you're too trusting of those who, for example, are going to again take your life savings, or who are recommending crap medicine, or if you trust politicians who are demagogues, who make very large promises with no intentions of carrying them out, who say, yes, they will act on your behalf. Yes, the election was rigged and fraudulent, yes, you cannot trust other parties or other politicians, but in fact, they're playing on your credulity. And of course, we don't need to go around the world for that. We can see that illustrated in the MAGA movement in America and the belief in conspiracy theories, which is so widespread in the United States. So what causes the problems of inaccurate judgments? So this is how we can operationalize it. We're trying to work out how people come to judgments of what is and is not trustworthy. And this can be at societal level, at the level of the state, or international agencies. How do I know, for example, whether the World Health Organization is an agency whose word I can trust, whether I should go along with their recommendations? Now, I need to think about their performance, and I need to have some macro level indicators. And I need to look at, for example, levels of corruption, or how far they have the capacity to actually deliver on what they promise. But I can't know it directly. In many cases, I have got very little direct experience on many issues. I need to form judgments. So I need to form public perceptions. And here, that is what is the intermediary variable between performance and your macro level indicators and your actual judgments. And that in turn, I'm arguing in the book, is influenced by your analytical skills, what you know, how educated are you? And the more information you have, and the more you have accurate information, the better your public perceptions and your judgments are going to be. But also, how far can I get information in the society around me? I could be well educated, but of course, if I live in a media bubble, for example, if I only watch CNN in America, or I only watch Fox News, I might well get information which is not accurate, misinformation, disinformation, and a variety of other problems. Similarly, if I lived in closed societies where there's problems of what information I can get, think about Iran and the protesters, which are very courageous, but in order to share information, they have to go through VPNs because of the censorship of the Iranian regime. And think about places where media pluralism has been cut back. Think, for example, about the repression of the Chinese government in Hong Kong, where independent news sources have been shut down and journalists have been forced to go into exile. And if there's few oversight mechanisms, then there'll be a problem in my public perceptions. So these things matter, and there's a feedback loop. You make judgments, and that might influence performance. So, for example, if you believe that COVID can be cured or at least mitigated by some of the vaccinations, then the performance of the health system is likely to be better. So let's think about the research design. How do I test these claims and these theories? I'm using the World Values Survey. And as many of you know, it's one of the biggest surveys worldwide. And it has gone and run from 1981 through to 2021. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary. It happens in 7 waves. And we're just about to launch the 8th wave, where considering the question should be asked. I'm part of this. And I'm the Vice President of the World Value Survey, and it now covers over 115 diverse societies, and they're both open societies with many different media outlets, with freedom of expression, and closed societies where there are many more problems in this regard. And it's always measured from the very earliest wave, interpersonal trust, that's between people, and institutional confidence, such as your trust in political parties or in television, news, or in the government, or in large-scale corporations. And we've added most recently trust in global governance in the 7th wave. And as part of the TrustGov project, we funded surveys in 13 diverse closed societies and added some new questions. So, for example, these are countries like Iran, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, Nicaragua, very, very different in their forms of governance. You might have a theocracy, or you might have a personal dictatorship, or you might have a one-party state. But nevertheless, all countries where we can test some of these arguments because they have limited freedom of expression. Now, let's look at the countries, and this is what it looks like in the map of which ones have been covered by the combined World Value Survey, European Value Survey over the years. And as you can see, we're pretty good in covering Latin America, North America, Scandinavia, Central and Eastern Europe ever since 1990, as well as parts of the Middle East and the MENA region and parts of Asia. The least coverage is in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, we are trying to expand that. And we do have a range of some of the larger countries like South Africa, Nigeria, which have always been part of the survey. This is what the countries look like when we classify those in the 7th wave by their freedom of expression and levels of democracy. So across the bottom, you've got from the Varieties of Democracy project, which is a separate set of expert judgments, how far there is freedom of expression and alternative sources of information available. And it's a 100-point scale, as you can see. And so we have some countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, Finland, France, Greece, also Slovakia and South Korea. So a range of new democracies like Croatia, as well as countries which are the standard Western European democracies. And on the vertical axis, we have liberal democracy. And obviously, freedom of expression is often correlated with levels of democracy, but it's not perfect. So you get some countries like Ukraine or Armenia or Slovenia, which tends to be a bit of an outlier, although not that far. And the surveys, the data point for this is from the most recent World Values Survey, Wave 7, and the year of the survey is matched to the VDEM index. And then we have the closed societies, where there's more limits, according to VDEM, on freedom of expression. And China, Tajikistan, Belarus, classic cases. And China, under President Xi, has become much more restrictive. There was an opening in the earlier era when there was a greater independence of the press, but now that opportunity has closed. Vietnam, Azerbaijan, Russia. And think about the way in which the Ukrainian special military operation, otherwise known as the invasion, has been covered. And it's immediately obvious how Putin has shut down any independent forms of expression, for example, protests on the street, with more draconian laws. And the public in Russia has very little information about the activities of their own army across the border in Ukraine. Iran is another classic case in point. And again, there are outliers, Hungary, for example, Ethiopia, Colombia, Myanmar, but you can see that there's a broad relationship. So these are the patterns that we're going to compare, and these are the cases. This is our measure from the World Values Survey of trust. And this is the factor analysis, which just shows the correlation between each of the different items. So if you want to look at trust in global governance agencies, you can look at things like the World Bank, NATO, United Nations, WHO, and so on. And as you can see, it's multidimensional. I'm not going to go through each of these dimensions. For example, I'm not going to talk in our evidence about in-group trust, which is trust in your family, or out-group trust, like trust in other people from a different country or a different religion, but nevertheless, the data is available. And the logic of my theory in the book is evident and can be used for any of these other forms of trust. So the test, the research design is very simple. It doesn't require that much technical understanding of what we can find. First, you need to measure levels of public trust in diverse agents and in very diverse societies. Then you need to gauge some measure of agency performance, ideally objective, for example, from the World Bank or from VDEM, or subjective, how citizens perceive the performance. And then you need to compare how far public trust correlates with performance indicators. Where there's a high and significant correlation, that's when we can claim that it's more skeptical, it's more informed, it's more accurate as a judgment. Now let's look at the results. And then we can come to the conclusions, and hopefully we can raise some Q&A and talk about some of the questions that may arise. So let's have a look first at some standard indicators of societal development. These are things which the UN and official agencies through official statistic offices gather all the time. They're used in things like the SDGs. And what we can do is we can compare a range of open societies, and we have about 25 to 43 open societies in the most recent wave of the World Values Survey. And we can see how far trust in government, measured as a 100-point scale, which combines trust in government, trust in parliaments, trust in parties, and trust in the civil service, correlates directly with a range of economic and social indicators. And I'm not using multivariate correlation, multivariate regression. I'm not including controls, partly because there's a lot of multicollinearity as soon as you start to do that. I'm just looking at a straightforward correlation between trust and the public, and then indicators. What do we see? Well, first, if you look at open societies, which are highlighted in green, you can see that most of the indicators are strongly and significantly related to public trust in government, and they point in the right direction, that to say the direction you might expect. So, for example, the more affluent your country with economic development, and the higher the level of economic growth that you've experienced in GDP per capita, then the more that you trust government. The higher the level of unemployment, however, then the less you trust government. The higher the level of inflation, then the less you trust government. Although that coefficient was not significant, in large part, I think, because until recently, inflation hadn't been the major challenge facing many of the governments, particularly in the period that the last wave was undertaken. I think that's going to go up and become more significant now that inflation and consumer prices are a problem around the world. And again, more economic inequality, both of those point in the right direction. The higher the income share for the rich, the more you don't trust government, the more egalitarian and the better the more well off the lowest group, the more you trust government. And it's not just economics. Social indicators work in a similar fashion by and large, although not all of them do. So the more education, the more you trust government. That's the cognitive idea. The homicide rate is a good indicator of local security in your community and your society. And again, the higher the homicide rate, then the less you trust government. And the other couple of indicators are pointing in the right direction, but they turn out to be not significant, which is fine because not every indicator should point in the same direction. It's not automatic. And that's based on a survey which we've got 30,000 respondents pooled in the open societies. But look at the closed societies. And these are the ones without freedom of expression according to VDEM. And we have roughly the same number of countries and roughly the same number of respondents. And what you can see is that immediately there's, in nearly every case, a not significant relationship. In some cases, the indices point in the opposite direction to that you might expect. For example, education, the more educated the population, the less they trust government in closed societies. And you can see also that there's only one which turns out to be significant, and that's unemployment, which is strong. So performance, for example, economic growth, doesn't turn out to be significantly related to how far people trust their government or trust a government like China. Let's look at this and break it out so we can see it as a data visualization where it becomes much easier to understand. And so what we've got here is, again, a scatter plot. Trust in government goes along the bottom, from low trust in a country like Peru, Tunisia, Guatemala, to high trust in places like China. And on the vertical index, you've got per capita GDP, which is your standard measure of economic development. What do you see? Well, the green societies are those which are classified as open, and there's a strong and significant line. The green line goes up. The more economic development, the most affluent countries in the world include those like Norway, with its North Sea oil, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, so Canada, New Zealand, Iceland, the Netherlands, many other countries, then the more that you are trusting of the government itself. And as we can see, in open societies, which have got much lower levels of development, Mexico, Croatia, Bulgaria, then we have lower levels of trust in government. And there are some exceptions which jump out. The United States, I've highlighted. It's one where you might expect from their level of income, which is very affluent, that there would be higher levels of trust, but there's always been a legacy of low trust in government in the United States, very different to Europe, very different to Scandinavia. And again, you can spot a couple of other outliers there. Hong Kong, for example. And I'd argue that Hong Kong at the time of the survey was classified as a closed society because it had recently, the Chinese government had stamped down on freedom of expression and independent voices and the umbrella movement, which sought to have a more democratic society. But there was still a legacy of trust in government from the earlier period when there'd been much more autonomy and the selection and election of their own government. Similarly, Singapore is an outlier, but Singapore is an outlier in nearly everything. However, let's look at the range of those closed societies, which are highlighted in red. What jumps out? Well, the first thing to observe is that China, as well as Vietnam, as well as Tajikistan, as well as the Philippines and Myanmar, which of course a military junta has taken back control after a short period of democratization under Aung San Suu Kyi, they have higher levels of trust, they say, in their government than places like Switzerland or Norway. But equally, you can have countries here which are closed societies and which have low levels of income. So we can see that the line is flat. There's no significant link between the level of per capita GDP at the time of the survey and trust in government. Well, what about other indicators? And I'll just show you these and then we can open it up for Q&A shortly. Trust in government may be linked not just with the policy output, but also with how government works, with the process, with good governance and democracy. And here what we have is some measures on things like the control of corruption, government effectiveness, rule of law, political stability, and so on from the World Bank, as well as the Liberal Democracy Index, which is from VDEM, the Variety of Democracy Project. And what's the relationships? Well, as you can see in the open societies, again, there's a strong and significant and consistently strong relationship between all of the indicators of political processes and how far people trust their government. And again, that's very logical according to my argument. The more that you have a control of corruption and liberal democracy, then the more likely you are to have a transparent and effective government that you should trust because they have the competency and the ability to deliver. And that's in 43 open society countries. By contrast, look at the columns for the closed societies, and these are the Chinas, Myanmars, Tajikistans of the world, Iran, Russia, and so on. And as you can see, in most cases, there's no significant relationship between levels of process, how far there's good governance, and trust. And indeed, when we come to the level of liberal democracy, it's negative, strongly negative and significant. The less democratic a country, the more people trust in closed societies. Let's have a look again at what this looks like with a data visualization. And here we can start to populate it with the different categories, which I mentioned in my typology. So on the vertical index, you've got the Good Governance Index, which is a composite from all of those measures by the World Bank. And across the bottom, trust in government. And again, the green line showing you the open societies is strong and significant as a regression line. So people trust their government more where they can have, and they live with a government which is effective, less corrupt, more honest, more competent. And where the government doesn't have those qualities, for example, in Guatemala, where there's high levels of corruption, in Croatia and Romania, in Peru, in cases where there's been instability, think about Tunisia, that was more democratic at the time of the survey, but of course reverted to a more authoritarian regime under the president. In Mexico, in Armenia, in all of those cases, we can see lower levels of confidence and trust in their government. What about the closed societies? And here we can see that there's almost no relationship at all, although slightly negative. And when we go to democracy, it's even more evident. And this is the Liberal Democracy Index from VDEM. And you can see that the more democratic the society, then the more people say in a survey that they trust their government using this index. The more open the society, the more people have, in a liberal democracy, trust in their government. So we see these four categories, and in some countries, we can see the skeptical mistrust. And that's, for example, in a place like Lebanon, where the government is highly unstable, where the economy has imploded, where there have been fundamental problems of security in some of their areas and political fragmentation. It makes it very difficult for the Lebanese government to deliver. And of course, the public is skeptically mistrusting of their leaders and of their parties and of those in authority. The same is true in Iraq, which has been riven by conflict, or Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega has become increasingly an authoritarian populist, removing the opposition. You should be mistrustful in those sorts of contexts. Cynical mistrust, well, you can see there are a number of different cases, including Italy, which has always had a high level of cynicism and mistrust, but also a number of other cases like Greece, Argentina, Croatia, Peru. And then lastly, again, the credulous trust are the cases like Myanmar. Myanmar remains one of the poorest countries in the world. It has real problems in trade because of international sanctions. It had a short period where the international community sought to aid Myanmar more actively when it looked as though the generals were loosening the reins of control. But once they threw opposition parties and opponents back into prison and caused all sorts of charges against dissidents, and they cracked down on their borders and freedom of expression, then they had real problems of governance and yet high levels of trust. So why? What explains credulous trust? Well, above all, the fact that in many of those societies, there's very little information, which gives you two-sided views. And so if the government controls state media, if there's censorship of the internet, so again, you don't hear alternative views from the international community, if listening to independent radio is seen as a crime, or there's very little other forms of information from newspapers, which are controlled again by either political parties in government or by the state directly, then you're likely to trust that propaganda and to only believe that the performance is good, even though in practice there are real problems of governance in those countries. So freedom of press, absolutely critical, and independent and plural views are really what makes people have much more skeptical trusting views rather than credulous trust. So the conclusions, well, the arguments is, as I said at the beginning, we should not necessarily think trust is good. It can be good because it can lubricate society. It can be fundamentally problematic if you believe the words of particularly authoritarian populists and those who make claims to speak for the people, but in practice produce highly corrupt government which are not serving the public interest and which seek to dismantle rule of law and to dismantle executive checks, such as weakening the legislature, such as passing electoral laws which benefit those in government but weaken the opposition, or stamping down on other human rights and basic freedoms. Trust and legitimacy may be valuable for governments and authorities, but not necessarily for the people. And lots of people make mistakes because when you make a judgment about trust, it's complex. You might not have the full information. In Russia, for example, people may believe that the army is seeking to, quote, liberate Ukrainians from the problems of, quote, Nazis. If you only watch state television, that may be what you believe. But it's an erroneous belief, and it's a fundamental problem for both Russian soldiers who are being sent to the front and for Russian society in its isolation, and obviously for the decimation of the Ukrainian state and society. So we need to build trustworthiness, competency, integrity, and impartiality, and effective institutional guardrails like watchdog organizations that can hold government to account. And all of this raises questions of whether popular support for authoritarian leaders and strongman leaders is actually genuine, and in particular, whether this leads to an erosion of soft democratic norms and practices. Now, it could be that we don't necessarily trust the survey data. For example, if you ask people in China about trust in parties or in the government, they may feel they can't answer honestly. But we did build in some checks into the survey, including list experiments, and they suggest that there is a bias in the survey data, but it's not sufficient to explain that high level of trust in government, which we've observed in China and in many other authoritarian regimes. So I think we need to really get to the root of whether legitimacy is not simply a quality of democracies, but whether people really do believe and provide popular support for many strongman rulers and strongman regimes in countries around the world. And that's the challenge which I'm now taking up, looking at the cultural roots of democratic backsliding. Thank you all very much for listening to this talk. I really look forward to your questions and your thoughts. And this is the book, and I look forward to seeing your response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Norris, for this lecture. We will first start with a brief debate with the questions posed by myself and my colleague, and then we will soon open the floor to the public. First, I would just like to underline that you have an extraordinary gift, that you write a book in the time of a major crisis when we need an intellectual guidance. But you provide a very sort of unconventional frame with Culture Backlash, which you co-authored with Professor Engelhardt, sorry. You actually looked into the rise of nationalism and authoritarian populism through the lenses of the culture backlash, through the lenses of culture wars. And you looked critically into the direction of to the left and cancel culture, etc., etc. And now we are at the critical moment of facing major mistrust into state institutions, institutions of welfare, health, science, media. And now you publish a work on trust, which is titled In Praise of Skepticism. And when I saw the title of the book, I was really quite skeptical and concerned in the sense, is it the right time to talk about skepticism when we need so much trust, unconditional trust even? And of course, unconditional trust is very problematic in itself, because we want to keep the democratic processes open. And for that to happen, we need to have a lot of criticism, perhaps even cynicism, but definitely skepticism. And when you mentioned the two options, Fox News and CNN, it seems to me that we are now in a state of affair where we think that CNN is absolutely legitimate and core source of our information. Only a few years ago, we would be highly critical of CNN, but now we are actually afraid that we will be labeled as someone who is in favor of the thesis of the fake media. So my opening question would be, why this book on trust and skepticism right now? And of course, we got some insight from your lecture today where you are leading us, but still, if you can perhaps just give us some further sort of highlights or points where we can focus our attention.
Thank you. Did you want any more? Did you want to gather any more comments, or would you like me to respond directly for those?
If you don't mind, perhaps if you can just, or would you prefer that we gather all the questions?
I'm happy to respond whatever format you'd like.
I would then perhaps suggest that we answer, that you answer by questions as you receive them, yeah.
So, you know, I've written, as you say, about cultural backlash and so on, but one of my earliest books, and the one which is often most cited, is the one on critical citizens. And that was a book which started as a conference with really excellent participants. And at the end of that, I always said that normatively there were these two dimensions, and you do want, to some extent, that citizens do trust, as you say, science and the media, where they're effective media, which are independent. You do want them to trust government authorities. You do want them to trust academics who have done a lot of research versus other views. But I always said that their citizens needed to be critical, and the assumption that people should be essentially affective in their views of trust is dangerous. It's dangerous for them, it's dangerous for the community, and it's dangerous for democracy. So you think about, for example, trust in the police. And the conventional assumption is always, of course, we should trust the police because they're there to protect us and to make sure that the community is safe and so on. But of course, if you're part of the Black Lives Matter movement and you look at some of the abuses of police authority, then immediately you'd say, well, you shouldn't trust them automatically. You should have watchdogs and you should have citizen bodies of oversight. You should have, for example, in the police, those cameras, which are now very conventional, where people can watch as much as possible the footage of the actual activity. And so when there's a problem of a complaint against the police, everybody can try and see what the causes were and whether it was legitimate or not. So we always argue in favor of transparency. We always argue in favor of effectiveness, and we always argue in favor of impartiality. And all of those are the components. If we can't judge them, if we are in a media bubble, and we totally believe whichever side of the media we watch or we like, if we're in negative partisanship and we never trust the other side, we only ever trust our side. If we're into this cultural backlash idea of us and them, and I am in a tribe, and I very much trust all my colleagues who are kind of liberal. I live in Cambridge, which is a very liberal place. It's a one-sided view. And, you know, we can go right back to John Stuart Mill as the normative basis of my ideas about how we should be critical. And John Stuart Mill, who wrote on liberty, always said you need to argue the other side, and you need to argue and deliberate with the other side in order to know your own views and to know whether or not you should accept those views and therefore assume that somebody is trustworthy, or whether you might want to be more critical. And skepticism is just my latest kind of version. I've said this for 20 years, by the way. I'm not saying anything brand new, but I wanted to say it in more depth and to work through the theory in greater detail, and to give people a better conceptual tool about what was meant by critical citizens. And the theory which I developed, I'm only really applying it, as you've seen here, in terms of government. But of course, if you're interested in trust in science, we know that there's bogus science. We know that there's all sorts of people claiming all sorts of things are flat Earth, or that you can't trust scientists. Well, you know, they need to think about these issues and use this model to think, how can they be more credible? How can they be more effective? How can they be more impartial in their findings? For example, on carbon emissions, people should be able to trust the data on climate change. And if they can't, because they don't know whether it's reliable, then that's a problem for scientists, right? And the same is true in every other dimension I talked about, whether it's medicine, whether it's the law, whether it's academic universities. So unconditional trust in general is dangerous. Will it get things done? Yes, it will. Is it always there? Yes, it is. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Affective trust, my feelings of trust towards people, is very strong. But as far as possible, I want to distance myself from my affect and think in a more informed basis. And in a way, all I'm saying in the book is that most of the work which has been done on trust for years and years has talked about levels of trust. Is it high? Is it low? Is it going down? Is it rising, etc., etc.? But that's not really sufficient. We also need to think about not just levels, but the quality of the judgments of trust, about the rationality of trust. And that's just as important as the level. If people are untrustworthy, we should make the judgment accurately that they're untrustworthy and not trust them.
Thank you very much for reminding us of all the political and philosophical legacies that we need to keep in mind. I will now pass the microphone to my colleague, Professor Mojca Pajnik. She's professor in political science and communication here at the Faculty of Social Sciences. Mojca, please.
Thank you very much, Pippa, for your lecture, for the latest book.
Alas, I can't quite hear. That's it.
Can you hear me?
That's perfect now. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Okay, thank you. I saw from your approach that you are partly taking the cognitive psychology approach in analyzing that routine behavior that people engage in reduces in a way discomfort by avoiding unpleasant disruption of our own beliefs or of our own bubbles.
Yeah.
So I think that changing or turning this routine behavior into articulation of the common good, into articulation of the public interest is something that is vital for trustworthy democracy. So I'm wondering, that this is one of the challenges in today rising of skepticism. However, this actually doesn't, of course, as you've also shown, develop only at the individual, so psychological level, but it's highly systematic, it's a political, it's a public issue, and you connect these two levels. You've shown in one of the slides the connection of this individual, family, beliefs, class-oriented to the political, cultural level. So I'm wondering if going forward, trust by verify that you discuss at the level of the individual behavior could be even more complemented and even more strengthened at the social and the political level. I'm thinking here from critical theory of the concept of public worthiness. So, instilling more of this sense of the community, not just putting to resolve the conflict at the individual level. So, and you, in your book, you at some point you mentioned this accountability safeguards that should be built within public institutions, within politics, within the political parties, within the media. So could these, if you think that could this have the potential to strengthen in a way the skeptical judgment that you are analyzing and in a way downsize the virality of the credulous trust? So, instilling more public worthiness and giving it more of this communal connotation, if you will.
No, absolutely. I think that this is really critical. And, we often think of trust in terms of individual leaders or individual politicians or even specific parties. But we need to think of it much more that you need a structure of a community-based and societal-based watchdogs who can really be effective in giving people the information that they can judge for themselves. And it needs to be on all sides. And I think of things like accountability safeguards in the United States. You've got formal and you've got informal accountability. So the formal accountability are meant to be things like the role of Congress in scrutinizing the presidential actions, and the role of the courts in adjudicating on those sorts of issues and making sure that the Congress and congressional committees can have hearings on particular public issues. And also the role of the media, who should be able to again act as a third safeguard on the role of those in power. But what you can find quite quickly under the recent period is that beyond the formal structures, you also have to have the soft norms of democracy, which actually make these things effective. And if you get a leader in power of any political persuasion, but who is willing to trample on those soft norms, immediately you get problems of freedom of expression and those institutions weaken. And one can see this developing in so many different parts of America. Again, America was always seen as a flagship for freedom of expression because of its Second Amendment, and everybody believed it was the place for independent journalists, right? And in terms of the amount of media and the pluralistic media that you can get, it's a cornucopia of different views that you can get right away from the far right through to the far left on various channels and especially through social media. But if the informal norms don't work, so that journalists themselves feel that they can only express one view on either the Democratic side or the Republican side, or the left or the right, and the public only tunes in to self-selecting and basically censoring the range of views which they hear. And then if the state starts to intervene, which it has done in various direct ways, for example, by the threats against journalists, which have really expanded in the United States, but also worldwide. if you look at things like freedom of the press, and you look at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and you look at the issues facing journalists in, for example, Mexico, and the problems which have been challenging from the drug cartels, or the challenges which are there in many other parts of the world, you see press freedom's gone down and media self-selection has gone up. And that's a perfect climate for the spread of misinformation. And that's where you need to build in really strong watchdog organizations like press councils, or like other forms of media education, so people start to understand that they need to have more than one source of information. And I think that this defense of freedom of the press, again, is hardly new, it's been there forever, but I think it's even more important in a world of misinformation and disinformation, because how does misinformation spread? It's basically just listening to one side, listening to us versus them, and not being open to alternative sources of information that exist, or just dismissing them and not feeling that they're credible, or that they can really be sources of information that you can judge for yourself. So it's a complicated way about how we can actually get out of our bubbles. In some cases, it's pretty obvious. If there's state censorship, then clearly that's a problem. But in Western countries, in Western democracies, which have plural media, but where the public only uses one side or another, then that's a major challenge. And I often think that the state can have a positive or negative influence on that. And I look in particular to the role of public service television and public service media as a way of making sure that there's balance. And my model, of course, as you may tell, I'm British originally. My model is always the BBC. And on the BBC, for example, in an election campaign, by law and by Oftel, the regulator, there has to be a certain amount of time given to the government, a certain amount of time given to the Labour opposition, a certain amount of time given to the SNP or the other minor parties and so on. And that regulation is basically in the public interest. It means that the public, when you turn on the television news during an election campaign, you hear the government and the opposition in the same kind of breath. By contrast, when you look at the United States, which has a commercial media, an amazing number of sources are available, but none of them feel an obligation to have media balance across all the parties, where the politicians talk to the politicians. They'll normally represent either one side or the other. And even those like public television normally assume that balance comes from journalists, not from politicians talking to each other. So if you turn on, for example, PBS, and you watch an election, what you'll have is journalists who represent a party, but not a direct representative in a debate where you can hear both sides of any argument. And I think that's a very unfortunate tendency, but it's one which is just very common in commercial television. So yes, there's a big role, not just for individual factors, but for the structure of regulation in political communications.
Thank you very much. Mojca and myself have a list of questions for you, but since we are sort of running out of our time, I would like to open the debate, give the opportunity to the public. If there is any question for Professor Pippa Norris, please just indicate so that our colleague will bring the microphone to you by raising your hand.
And they can also use the meeting chat. That's another way to, if they're online.
Yes, you can also pose the question in the chat, but we would rather like to hear you. Okay, when you're thinking about your questions that you would like to pose, perhaps in the meantime, I would use the opportunity and ask another question. You mentioned media education.
Yeah.
And recent studies in the field of social media research show that actually there's a lot of rational decision going about not to be informed, or rational decision for the right to be not informed. Or there's a book, many books written recently on the resistance to knowledge, resistance to information. And I'm wondering, I mean, what you are mentioning are really elements of the modern social contract, where we have public sphere, when we have public institutions, where we have certain consensus on how to govern our public sphere, public good, deliberation, etc., etc. So I'm wondering, where do we bring, perhaps going back to your culture backlash, where do we bring the emotional aspect in? Because it seems to me that this is a vital part of the education we cannot ignore. Because the resistance to elites is exhibiting itself in many forms, and one of the forms definitely is this emotional claim not to be informed or to really stay in the bubble of one's own choice. So how to tackle that issue?
So that's a very good question. And really, we can think of it that there's two things that people are doing. One is you're in an environment in which it's state censorship, which is still there, which is limiting what information you have. And that's a problem about the structure of the state and about freedom of expression and about basic human rights and how we can try to strengthen those legally, constitutionally, etc. The other is self-censorship. And that's essentially where you either don't express criticisms because you fear the consequences, or you self-censor in what information sources you rely upon, and you therefore put yourself into your own information bubble. And there's always been selective perception. We know that. When you have a variety of different media sources, you want to go to those ones which are conducive to your beliefs because they reinforce them, it's comfortable. You find you're in a community and you find like-minded people who agree with you. But of course, that self-selection, which always used to be there with newspapers, and to some extent with television, although less with television when it was regulated, is also even multiplied 100 times by social media. So that's where we all go into only the sources which we're most familiar with and which tend to reflect our political views. At the same time, I don't think we should blame the technology necessarily for that. If you want to use alternative sources of information through the social media, there's more today than there ever has been. There's an avalanche of different sources of information which is always available. So essentially, it's to do with the individual and what you seek out. And the whole role of education, if you think about it in the broadest sense, is not to teach people what to know. You teach people how they can come to their own judgments. I mean, that's the ideal. And therefore, our role as educators, and the role more generally, is to make people skeptical. It's the whole notion of science. Think about Karl Popper. What was his argument about what defines science versus the arts or humanities? And for him, it's putting forward bold conjectures, which you attempt to refute. And nobody wants to refute their conjectures. Nobody wants to shoot down their own theories. Nobody wants to challenge their own beliefs. On the other hand, if you don't, then you're likely to be essentially not acting in your own self-interest and not acting certainly in your community's interest, and you're not being effective as a democracy because you're not going to think that your own partisan perceptions or your own preferred way of thinking about the world is actually the one which is accurate or not. So yes, of course, there's going to be affect. Of course, we're going to feel that we want to have the reassurance of believing the sources that we most trust, but that's not good enough. And it's not about making arguments, it's not about making claims, it's about making arguments that you then try to knock down. You find other sources of information. You search for the weaknesses of your argument. You search for people who are going to be critical of your perspective. That, for me, is the ideal of natural sciences, but also of social sciences. And in a sense, that's what I'm also talking about when I talk about citizens. They should also be searching for alternative sources of information and alternative voices and a diverse set of perspectives. And you only know that they're diverse by arguing your case and exposing yourself to criticisms. And we can do that in the current technology, but whether we choose to do that is just another matter. And there's all sorts of reasons why we don't.
Thank you, Pippa. I would like to address now maybe a bit of a methodological issue. So it seems now with the rise of authoritarian populism globally, so the fundamental principles of understanding democracy have been changing. So diminishing the rule of law, the autonomy of the media, so the independence of institutions and so on. So I'm wondering how in these circumstances now and for the future, you think we would need to revise, perhaps on a more scale-sensitive analysis, how we analyze, how we understand and measure trust, also to a bit disrupt this, Scandinavian countries are always over there. And
they always are, that's right.
From Sweden and Denmark are a bit, unhappy with this, or to juxtapose emotion and reason. So open, closed societies also, because it seems that with these populist contingencies, things are really changing really, fast. And I'm wondering what do you think this means for measuring trust based on the methods that have been established by you, Engelhardt, Putnam, and for these 40 years of tradition of analyzing trust in public opinion. For example, if I think of the media sphere, so as you mentioned, Ksenija, so people now choose not to be informed. Also, this is can be a valid standpoint. So it's what does this mean for for the questions like, do you trust in media? Are we satisfied with these types of analysis, or we would perhaps need a more nuanced, I haven't actually seen the indicators that you used, but perhaps the more, nuanced understanding of whether people, or to what an extent they think media are vital for democracy in certain periods, because these shifts have been changing really fast, I think. So, yeah, thank you.
So I think methodologically, there are some real questions which are raised by this approach. One is essentially about how far you can trust measures of trust. In other words, if you ask people, do you trust your government in China? Are they really going to answer in an honest way? And so that's a fundamental issue. So what we did methodologically was we used a list experiment. And list experiments have been tried for trust in leaders, for example, in Putin, to see whether or not the Russian public really does trust him and he has 80% approval, or whether that's fallacious and Russians are saying they trust him when they really don't. So we split our sample in 13 countries, which are very the authoritarian ones that we mentioned. And we basically asked one half about, they were split at random. We asked one half, how much do you trust the following, how many of the following leaders do you trust? And we gave them 4 answers. So how many, whether it's Angela Merkel, Donald Trump, President Putin, and say one other leader. And then we got also, for the other half of our sample, 5 items. So we asked them all of those leaders, and then we asked them, do they trust their own head of state? And so the difference between the two is our measure of how far that there's essentially a measure of trust in your own individual leader. And then we also asked them directly how far they trusted their leader. So we're not asking them, it's like any social response bias. You can ask people about, for example, sexual behavior, and you never know whether you're going to be able to trust the answers. Or you can trust them about criminality. For example, have you ever taken a bribe? And you never know whether you're going to trust the results of your surveys, because it might be that people condition their response partly because of the interviewers and social acceptability and so on. So when we used this list experiment, what we found was there was a bias in these closed societies. When you ask people directly or indirectly, the size of the bias was about, however, 13 points on a 100-point scale. So it wasn't enormous. People did exaggerate through the indirect method, how far they said they trusted their leader, but it wasn't enough to prevent these enormous differences that we have observed between the open and the closed societies. So that's one answer. But the other answer is also, what else do we need to measure to really get at essentially democratic backsliding? And when I've looked at all the measures which are available through all the global barometers, Eurobarometers, et cetera, what we tend to ask during the third wave era is trust in what I term big D. How far do you think democracy is the best form of governance? And then we ask them trust in other forms of authoritarian regimes. For example, do you want a strongman leader who doesn't have to bother with elections? Do you want to have the army step in case of political instability? Do you want to have religious leaders in power? I think what we need to ask instead, and what I'm trying to develop for the 8th wave, are soft norms which don't mention democracy and they don't mention autocracy. So there are genuine debates about things. For example, if a newspaper or an online media site publishes hate speech, should the government step in to prevent them doing so? So that question, do you approve or disapprove of that, is about soft norms which actually make democracy work, but which don't cue people directly to be either in favor or against that statement. There's genuine questions. If a group uses violence in a demonstration, should they be imprisoned? Or if citizens use violence? If a party advocates limits to the freedom of expression for another political party, should there be changes to the constitutional sanctions against that party? I think we need to think of a range of activities that some people do approve of and some people don't, to really think about how the soft norms work in any democracy and in an authoritarian regime, and also take seriously the values of security and order that many people in more authoritarian regimes actually do approve of. When you think about what they're looking for from their government, they might not be looking for freedom of expression. They might simply want to have a stable government which they know can deliver public services and produce growth and actually, produce the material needs of life. When you're thinking about a country which is very poor like Bangladesh, decimated by floods like Pakistan, or with other sorts of social stability problems in terms of economic or social stability like in Haiti or in Lebanon and so on. I think in our surveys, tend to use our surveys after democracies have already started. For example, in many Central and Eastern European countries, they started essentially with representative surveys in 1990. But we need to think about all of those countries which haven't opened up, do more work, and really try to work out and tap into popular support for strongman regimes. And I hope that that's what we're going to be able to prioritize in Wave 8, amongst other things.
Thank you very much, Pippa. I hope you have time to answer this question, which we got in our chat room very briefly. The question is, I wonder what is your opinion on the crucial question, who decides which sources are trustworthy? Is it for public authorities to censor news sources, or should the market of ideas remain free? This is especially in light of the documents recently leaked, the documents collusion between public authorities and private fact checkers on social media and the censorship of media financed by the Russian government.
So this is a big issue, of course, in terms of fact checking and what impact fact checking has. And most of the social psychological research says most of the time, even though it sounds worthy, and newspapers should fact check any leaders or positions of authority, in practice, what you're doing is amplifying the lie, because people don't necessarily you have to put in your newspaper and in fact check columns, such and such is being claimed, that the election in Maricopa County was fraudulent and we shouldn't trust the voting machines. Was that true? And then you get the counter argument which says, no, it wasn't true. In fact, the electoral authorities was true. But the problem is that by reporting on that, you're actually reinforcing the lie as much as reinforcing the opposite view. So fact checking in the current tradition and process, which has been implemented now in many newspapers and many media channels, doesn't actually get at what you're trying to get at. And what you need is much more of a kind of the scientific model. When we think about whether you're going to get published, whether you're doing work on AIDS, or you're doing work on the vaccinations, or you're doing work in science in general, on public health, you need to have alternative peer-reviewed scrutiny who can give you alternative views which are genuinely debated and which are out there in the public sphere. And so people can hear from a variety of different perspectives and make their own judgments based on more information and the work, insofar as we have them, of peer-reviewed watchdogs on any of these issues. So to give you a concrete example, when we think about the fraudulence of elections, what the media did in America in the 2022 was to make people much more aware, for example, that elections take some time to be counted. You can't expect it to be overnight. That electoral officials, they went into the process in some detail about how votes are counted, how election machines work, how results are collected and balloted and all the rest of it. People became more informed in America about the whole electoral administration process, which I think in 2016 they took for granted, but they didn't know anything about it at all. They just said, okay, our elections must work. And then when people criticized them, they had no information to judge how election officials were appointed or what role they played. In 2022, people were more informed, genuinely. The media spent a lot of time on that in the run-up to the election. And as a result, partly of that, I think there was no violence and there was no pushback. And there were very few protests. It was amazing, in fact, how much even those electoral deniers who were on the ballot accepted the results, because public opinion basically went against electoral denial, and they got punished through democratic means. In other words, people voted against them. So you can trust the public to come to correct judgments where they have the information, but if they don't have the information, then it's not surprising if they're skeptical about the validity or the accuracy of one view or another view. So more information, more diverse information, more pluralistic information is really the basic channel to go. And again, the more that we can do that through all sorts of agencies, the more transparent our processes of governance, then the more trustworthy they become.
Thank you very much. Any last question, comment, opinion? I think we have exhausted our plenary lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Pippa Norris, for this wonderful talk. There's a lot to think about, to read thoroughly your book, of course, which is arriving to our public library at the university this week, we hear.
Good.
So it will be for sure an obligatory reading in several classes. Thank you very much again, and we do hope to see you in Ljubljana in person very soon. All the best to you. And
thank you so much, and good luck with everything in your week-long meeting. I hope that the event goes well, and I wish I could join you. Thank you very much indeed.